beautiful morning. This is calm. It's really pretty.
So what's a river for? For centuries, here on Maryland's lower eastern shore, the idea was to make rivers do one thing very well: move the rain off croplands quick as possible. This meant drying out swamps that used to teem with wildlife, straightening the lazy bends of rivers and creeks into efficient drainage ditches. In the 1970s, a couple of come-heres, Joe and Ilya Ferrer, dared to stand up for a different vision along the Pocomoke River. The river doing no one thing well, just maximizing life in all its diverse splendor, as nature intended. Today, their decades of hard-won environmental consciousness raising are nowhere more triumphant than Nassawango Creek. It flows 18 miles to the Pocomoke through unbroken forest and wetlands, one of the jewels of the Chesapeake Bay region and of international significance. The elder Ferrers are gone now, but their legacy flourishes. Nassawango has become the passion of their son, Joe Ferrer Jr., a passion he is passing on to his kids and grandchildren.
They're pretty in all seasons, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So I grew up in Snow Hill, a few blocks away from the Pocomoke River. When I was a little kid, 50 years ago, my folks started buying some old Grumman canoes. And in the summer, we would walk down the street carrying a Grumman canoe several blocks. And we'd hang out, paddling, playing in the river, swimming, all day. The conversations around the breakfast table or the dinner table was environmental advocacy. It was really interesting, and I just wish I'd paid more attention.
Back then, environmentalism was a fighting word to many on the lower Maryland shore, a radical-seeming challenge to the status quo of sprawl development and ag drainage ditching.
They became environmentalists before a lot of people down here understood what that meant. There was a lot of angst from the farming community when my parents would oppose state permits or Army Corps permits to dredge or to ditch and that sort of thing. In the morning you'd walk outside and there'd be a dead hawk, or I remember one time there was somebody that killed a great horned owl and threw it up there on their porch. And at public meetings and hearings, it was not unusual for my mother especially to get heckled and called all sorts of nasty stuff.
I remember canoeing with Joe's folks 30 years ago, one of those Chesapeake moments that stick with you the rest of your life. Deep in the swamp, a carpet of green duckweed floated on the translucent black water, and every paddle stroke mixed the two, essaying a swirling liquid calligraphy in jade and onyx. Old bald cypress thrust from shade toward a bright blue sky. Slants of afternoon sun burnished the canopy of their autumn foliage to a cinnamon glow. High above came a V of tundra swans, hallooing their arrival from the Yukon.
They took out hundreds of people. That was just what they did. It was their form of outreach and education.
Joe's parents brought Nassawango Creek to the attention of the Nature Conservancy, which initially was given 150 acres by a timber company in the late 1970s. Their son joined TNC in 1978 as a volunteer. Today, his full-time stewardship job for the organization includes virtually the whole 18-mile length of the creek.
I remember a lot of conversation back and forth, like, well, how much is enough? So was 1,000 acres enough? You know, when we hit that threshold, well, let's see if we can go to 3,000 acres. We hit that threshold. So where we are now, 41 years out, the Conservancy owns 40% of the Nassawango watershed, which totals out to be around 11,000 acres. We're still looking at land protection opportunities in this watershed because we still haven't answered that question of how much is enough. The water that we're looking at here is eventually going to make its way all the way down to the creek down Nassawango Creek to the Pocomoke River and ultimately end up in Pocomoke Sound. Nassawango is a really important green corridor because as the climate changes, as sea level rises, species are going to get squeezed. And to be able to have these green corridors that they can move upslope, basically, and find that little climate niche that they need to survive are going to be critically important. You link up these protected lands. Where there is no linkage, you fill that in with protected lands. My dad especially would visit Nassawango Creek on a regular basis. 52 times a year over several years, he got out on this creek and paddled. And as I've gotten older now, I've come to appreciate why he did that. There's just a certain beauty to this place that changes weekly. Certainly changes seasonally. I used to come out here with my mom and dad, your great-grandmom and great-granddad, and this whole area here was all wild rice. Man. And there was still a little bit of wild rice that grows along the edges, but this whole area, everywhere the spatter dock is, was wild rice. And we'd come out in that canoe, and Nana and Papa, a couple of us kids, and we would paddle into this wild rice bed, and we did what the Native Americans did for centuries. We'd take the wild rice and shake it out over the boat, and Pop-Pop would paddle through, and we'd be shaking this stuff. Yeah. It was great fun when you're a kid. And we'd get all this wild rice in the canoe, and then it would get collected and put into bags, taken home, and we'd eat that. That's cool. For me, it's this legacy thing, right? I'm standing on the shoulders of my mom and dad, and I hope one of my kids will stand on my shoulders. That to me is what's really important.
Does it smell like lemon?
It's this continuity of appreciation and effort.
My grandparents, which is your great-grandparents, they worked hard to make sure that this land was available, just like it was for them. So the only thing that's really changed since they protected this property and helped work towards that is the trees got bigger. And maybe some different animals have moved around. But the water, it's still the same color. So the reason that this area is here, like it is now, without people influencing it, messing it up, it's because of people like Nana and Papa.
There's a tremendous variety of habitats that we have here. It ranges from tidal wetlands to non-tidal wetlands. We have bogs and even xeric sand ridges. So we have quite a bit of biodiversity here.
At last count, there was 96 or so rare, threatened, or endangered plant species in the Nassawango watershed. And this one up here is Seaside Alder. That's a globally rare shrub. That's why it's important to save these places. We're standing on the transition zone between the northern species coming south and the southern species moving north. And so you get this great intermingling of species diversity here at Nassawango. It's incredible. At one point on the lower shore, Atlantic white cedar was a very common bottomland tree that was very economically viable. And now it's one of the very rare habitat types here on the lower shore. So we're restoring 40 acres, I think at last count, of Atlantic white cedar.
Smoke dispersal is poor early, increasing to good in the afternoon.
In some of those areas, we also manage with fire. So as we remove the pine, we leave all the native hardwoods and then manage those areas with fire to try to stimulate the ground and the plant growth, but also to hopefully draw species that need fire to grow and persist.
There's always been fire, and many of these species, plants, animals, insects, are adapted to fire. They need fire. And when we've taken fire away, what's happened is the species composition and the structure of this area has changed. It's more closed in, it's a little darker, and there's a lot of what we call fuel on the ground. Lots of leaves building up, lots of branches building up. So what we're doing is we're burning off all of that fuel, And we're allowing sun-loving plants, a lot of the ephemeral wildflowers, to come back up. Down on the far side, we have a lot of pond pine. And pond pine is really interesting. It's serotinous. So the pine cones are glued shut with sap, and they need fire to open up and release the cones. So we're not getting a lot of pond pine regeneration in this area. By reintroducing fire, we hope to get a resurgence of the pond pines. But there's other species too. We have a lot of really nice shortleaf pine here, and we're hoping to encourage more of the shortleaf pine as well.
In our newly burned unit, we've been looking at 3 species of orchids.
Here's the yellow fringed.
The white fringed orchid, the yellow crested orchid, and the hybrid between the 2 species called Canby's bog orchid. As opposed to last year before the burn, we've got easily double the number of flowering plants. Each of these species here are all rare in the state of Maryland, with this one being only found at this particular location.
But we'll also see some really interesting plants in the wetter area. Pitcher plants love fire. And we have a site just south of here where we've burned 3 times, and it's a historic pitcher plant site, but the pitcher plants blinked out. They weren't there anymore. And after our 3rd burn in that site, the pitcher plants came back, which is really exciting.
Pitcher plants are really a neat carnivorous plant, which is fairly rare. It's on the list for Maryland, and it likes open, boggy areas, and there aren't too many of those left, unfortunately. We have a couple rare sundews that grow in the area, which are also carnivorous plants. We have several grasses and sedges that are also on the rare list. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't get too excited about grasses and sedges, but they can be just as rare or more so than some of the showy plants, and we need to preserve their habitat as well.
We never had any beaver here on the lower shore. They had been extirpated in the mid-1700s for their pelts. So they were gone for a couple of 100 years. But now we see a lot of beaver. There's beaver dams. This is another instance where if you kind of leave nature to its own devices, it'll restore itself.
When we do these restoration activities, like putting fire back on the ground, the results are right there for you to see. When the orchids reemerge, when the pitcher plants reappear, when the red-headed woodpeckers show up unexpectedly, it gives you such a sense of satisfaction that you're doing the right thing.
Atlantic white cedar, orchids, carnivorous pitcher plants. Just reciting all the parts that are coming back can't begin to conjure the whole. Only canoeing the Nassawango through all the moods of the day and the seasons can do that.
What keeps me coming to work every day is the joy that I get out of seeing my grandchildren see this place just as I did when I was in my teenage years. And that to me is powerful.